Two local cops laughed when they dragged a quiet black man into court until he dropped a DOJ badge on the bench and flipped the entire courtroom upside down. His name, Elias Monroe. His job exposing departments that think silence hides the truth. What happened next shook an entire town. Watch how power unravels one voice at a time. Like, share, and subscribe for more true justice stories. Trust us. This one's unforgettable. The moment Elias Monroe stepped into the courtroom, no one paid him much attention, just another disheveled man in a wrinkled coat, walking slowly with no lawyer, no folder, no entourage. His shoulders were slightly hunched from the weight of a long drive. His shoes were dusty, and his face, though calm, carried that unreadable stillness people too often mistake for weakness. It was just past 9:30 in the morning on a humid Thursday in Millstone, Georgia, and courtroom 2B was packed tighter than usual. The air was stiff with boredom and barely contained heat. A row of bored-looking officers lined the back wall. One of them leaned toward the other, smirking. "That him," he whispered, nodding toward Elias. "Gotta be," the other replied, "probably one of those sovereign citizen types. You know, the ones who think laws don't apply to them." The first one chuckled, shaking his head. "Watch, he's gonna tell the judge the Constitution's on his side." The two of them laughed a little louder than they should have, just enough to draw glances, but Elias didn't react. He just kept walking, calm and quiet, down the center aisle. His name had been called Elias Monroe, but it barely caused a ripple in the room. The clerk had announced it like it was a footnote. No one stood, no one shifted, until Elias did. He stopped before the defense table and looked up at the judge, a pale, balding man named Richard Claiborne, whose voice had the nasal tone of a tired radio announcer. Judge Claiborne peered over his glasses and flipped through the paperwork, a file so thin it barely made a sound. "Mr. Monroe," the judge said, adjusting his mic, "you're here today regarding a charge of obstruction during a traffic stop. Is that correct?" "That's what the report says," Elias replied, voice low but clear. Claiborne looked mildly irritated. "I don't see any counsel listed for you." "Are you representing yourself?" "I am." Another chuckle from the back. Claiborne didn't look up, but the corners of his mouth tightened. It wasn't the first time this courtroom had seen someone walk in thinking they could out-talk the law. To him, this felt routine, a procedural tap dance, something to get through before lunch. "Well," the judge sighed, "this is classified as a low-level misdemeanor. No prior offenses on record. We'll keep this brief. Mr. Monroe, anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Elias stepped forward. Not fast, not dramatic. Just one calm step closer to the bench. The two officers from the back straightened slightly. One of them instinctively let his hand hover over his holster. Elias reached into his coat. The air shifted. The room tensed in the space of a heartbeat. But instead of a threat, Elias pulled out a slim, laminated badge, a federal one, and placed it gently on the edge of the judge's bench. The courtroom stilled instantly. Conversations died mid-whisper. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too loud. "My name," Elias said, "is Elias Monroe. I'm a senior compliance auditor with the Office of the Inspector General, U.S. Department of Justice. I oversee internal reviews for misconduct investigations across the southeastern region, including departments flagged for irregular stop patterns and frequent body cam malfunctions." You could have heard a pin drop or a heart stop. The judge's eyes didn't leave the badge for several seconds. His lips parted slightly, like he was about to speak, but no words came. The two officers in the back were frozen now, their previous smirks wiped clean like chalk in a storm. One of them blinked fast. The other shifted on his heels like he needed to sit down. The clerk, Ms. Helen Dorsey, who'd seen 30 years of traffic court and petty thefts, stood from her desk, her eyes wide. She leaned toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "shall I verify the badge?" The judge's response was immediate. "Yes, please do." She didn't even sit back down. She walked out of the courtroom with Elias's badge in hand, dialing as she moved. Elias stepped back. He said nothing more. The silence in the room now wasn't awkward. It was electric. You could feel it. The weight of realization sinking in. This wasn't some local troublemaker. This wasn't a street lawyer trying to game the system. This was federal, and they hadn't just arrested him. They had mocked him, joked about him, yanked him out of his car, and dragged him into a courtroom like he was a nobody. 10 minutes passed in near total stillness. The judge sipped water, but his hand shook. The prosecutor kept scanning the paperwork like it might morph into something less dangerous. The two officers stared at Elias, then the door, then each other, panic creeping into their eyes like ink in water. Finally, the door opened again. Helen walked back in. She didn't smile, didn't blink, just nodded toward the judge. "Confirmed," she said, reading off her notepad. "Badge number is active. Senior Compliance Auditor, OIG, DOJ Southeast. 28 years of service. Background checks out. Clearance level verified." And just like that, everything changed. The weight of the room tilted in Elias's direction. Suddenly, the man who walked in alone, dusty and unarmed with anything but calm, was the most powerful person in the room. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," Elias said evenly, addressing the judge and not bothering to turn around. "I didn't even come here to file a complaint. I was on assignment, off record, passing through Millstone as part of a review on flagged departments. I identified myself, presented legal documentation, and was forcibly removed from my vehicle during an unlawful stop." The judge fumbled. "Mr. Monroe, if you'd like to file I don't need to file anything," Elias interrupted. The interaction was recorded. The stop violated both departmental protocol and federal rights law. And now we're here. The judge looked down. "Charges will be dropped, effective immediately." But Elias wasn't done. He turned slowly, finally meeting the eyes of the two officers. "This isn't about me," he said, steady and surgical. "It's about every person you've treated like they didn't matter, every driver you've pulled over for looking out of place, every story that ended in unfounded because the victim didn't have a badge to flash." No one clapped. No one spoke. The moment didn't need volume, because the truth had arrived and it had a name. Elias Monroe. And this was only the beginning. The courtroom still hadn't recovered from the moment Elias Monroe reached into his coat and laid that badge on the judge's bench like it was a verdict. Not a sound followed. Not a foot shuffled. Not a throat cleared. Not even the clock on the back wall dared to tick too loudly. It was the kind of silence that only comes when the air itself has been stunned into stillness. Just 5 minutes earlier, 2 local cops had laughed loud enough to echo off the wooden paneling mocking the way Elias walked, joked about his lack of legal counsel, smirking because they thought they knew who he was. They had seen what he looked like and decided they didn't have to care who he was. Now, they couldn't breathe. The badge gleamed softly under the fluorescent lights. Laminated, but worn at the edges, the kind of credential you only get after decades of quiet. exacting work. And it didn't say attorney or public defender. It said Senior Compliance Auditor, Office of the Inspector General, United States Department of Justice. And in smaller print beneath that, specializing in law enforcement misconduct and use of force violations. Elias hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't slammed his hand on the bench. He had simply placed the truth where everyone could see it and let it speak louder than anything else in the room. The judge, Richard Claiborne, was still frozen, lips slightly parted, eyes locked on the badge like it had grown fangs. His robe, once a symbol of authority, suddenly looked too large for him. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak. "Mr. Monroe, you're saying you're with the Department of Justice." Elias didn't blink, not saying, confirming. Claiborne coughed lightly and reached for his glass of water, missing it slightly on the first try. His hands were trembling. "You're here as part of an investigation." Elias nodded once, slowly. "I've been conducting field reviews of flag departments in the Southeast for the past 6 months. Millstone PD came up in connection with 6 separate reports of unlogged traffic stops, missing body cam footage, and 1 open internal discrimination complaint that mysteriously closed itself. One of the officers in the back, the bald one who'd yanked Elias from his rental car, shifted his weight. His face had drained of all color. The other leaned over and whispered, "You think this is real?" Elias didn't need to hear the whisper to answer it. He turned his head just enough to look directly at them, not angry, not smug, just deliberate. "You didn't ask who I was," he said, "because you thought you already knew." The clerk, Helen Dorsey, who had just verified the badge with DC, stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Your Honor," she said, holding her notepad tightly, "I spoke directly with OIG headquarters. The badge number matches. Clearance confirmed. 28 years in federal service. No red flags." The judge swallowed hard. "Thank you, Miss Dorsey." A low hum passed through the gallery, a breath that had been held too long. People began to lean forward, whispers creeping in now, not of mockery, but of disbelief. Elias continued, his voice still calm. "This court hearing wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to be charged. I wasn't even supposed to be stopped. I complied, provided my license, remained respectful, and said nothing that violated local or federal statute. Yet, I was yanked from my vehicle, thrown face first onto the shoulder of a highway, and held in a cell for more than 8 hours. No call, no supervisor, no explanation." The prosecutor, a young man who had clearly hoped for a quiet docket, finally stood, papers shaking slightly in his hand. "Your Honor, we weren't made aware of Mr. Monroe's status when charges were filed. I'd like to request." Elias held up a hand. "You weren't supposed to know. I was traveling off record as part of an unannounced compliance check. But your officers failed to follow even basic stop and release procedure. I didn't resist. I didn't escalate. But they did. And that's the problem." The prosecutor sat down without finishing his sentence. Now it wasn't just a courtroom, it was a reckoning chamber. Elias stepped to the side so everyone could see the badge still sitting on the judge's bench. "This," he said, gesturing to it, "isn't about status. It's about the fact that if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And probably already has." From the second row, an older black woman named Martha Graves, whose grandson had been stopped 3 times in the last year for matching a vague description, covered her mouth with her hand. Next to her, a local teacher clutched her purse a little tighter. People were remembering things they'd tried to forget, moments that hadn't ended in courtrooms because they never had the chance to begin. The judge looked like he wanted to shrink into his robe. "Mr. Monroe," he began. I deeply regret I'm not here for your regret," Elias said, sharp but still measured. "I'm here for accountability." And that, finally, was when the laughter that had once echoed in the courtroom was replaced by something heavier. Shame. One of the officers finally spoke. The bald one. Officer Ryan Phelps. "We didn't know who you were." "All right," he said, his voice cracking. "If we'd known—" "That's the point," Elias replied, turning to face him fully. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect." That line hit like a hammer. Not shouted, not screamed, just placed into the room with the same quiet authority that Elias had carried with him since the moment he stepped through the door. The judge reached for the mic again. "This court formally dismisses all charges against Mr. Monroe, effective immediately. And I request that both arresting officers be placed under immediate administrative review pending federal inquiry." Elias didn't flinch. He picked up his badge, nodded once, and walked back to the defense table. Behind him, the courtroom sat stunned, like they were just waking up from a very long, very comfortable lie, because the truth had just walked in. And it wasn't loud. It was undeniable. Before the courtroom froze, before the judge stammered, and before Elias Monroe dropped a badge that detonated the illusion of control. There was a quiet, humid night on the outskirts of Millstone, Georgia, where it all began. It was just after 10:30 p.m., a stretch of two-lane highway, slick, with the dew, and Elias was behind the wheel of a silver Toyota Camry. Rental tags barely visible under dust from the road. He didn't drive fast, didn't weave, didn't give anyone a reason. But in Millstone, that didn't matter, not when you looked like him and drove a car with out-of-town plates. Not when your face said, "Black man traveling alone," and your clothes said, "Unimportant." The blue and red lights appeared behind him like a flare in the dark. No siren, just light, just warning. Elias exhaled. He'd been expecting it not that night specifically, but eventually. In places like Millstone, silence didn't mean safety. It meant you were being watched. He pulled over slowly, checked his mirrors, placed both hands on the wheel. The road was empty, except for the cruiser behind him. He turned on the overhead light inside the Camry, something he always did during late-night stops, and waited. Two officers stepped out, both white, mid-30s, one bald with a heavy frame and a flashlight that clicked twice as he approached. Beam already aimed at Elias's face. The other stayed to the right, slowly circling toward the passenger window. The bald one knocked hard on the glass before Elias could even finish lowering it. "License and registration." Elias's voice stayed level. "Can I ask the reason for the stop?" The officer's tone sharpened. "You didn't use your blinker on the last lane change." Elias had. He knew he had. The tick-tick of it had been audible inside the cabin. But he didn't argue. He didn't move yet, either. "My documents are in my coat pocket and glove box. I'm reaching now." The officer didn't respond. Elias moved slowly, deliberately, handing over both. The second officer appeared at the passenger window, peering inside like he was expecting a second suspect. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Elias kept his gaze forward. "Can't say." "You can't? Or you won't?" Elias turned his head slightly. "Federal travel protocol. I'm restricted from disclosing current assignment." That did it. The bald officer's eyes narrowed. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Elias didn't reply. His badge wasn't visible. His tone didn't shift, but the air changed. That word federal ignited something the way truth often does when it's spoken to the wrong person at the wrong time. "Step out of the vehicle," the bald officer barked. Elias paused. "I haven't refused anything. I asked a question. Step out. Now." He knew what was coming, not from panic, from pattern. He'd read the reports. Dozens. The same language. The same excuse, non-compliant. The same outcome. He didn't resist. He opened the door. Stood tall. But that wasn't enough for them. They grabbed his arms, twisted, forced him to the ground, one knee in his back, gravel biting his cheek. Flashlight now pointed down like he was a threat. Not a man. He didn't cry out, didn't curse, just stared straight ahead. There was a small click in his coat pocket, barely audible. A habit. A habit born from years of auditing departments where silence wasn't just a failure of policy, it was part of the design. An audio recorder had turned on. Not a wire. Not a sting. Just protection. Just truth. The officers called in the stop as refusal to comply. No mention of force. No mention of the fact that Elias had handed over his ID, had spoken calmly, had followed every law they were supposed to uphold. The cruiser's dash cam stayed on, but the body cams, nothing. Dead. Technical malfunction. They'd claim later. They didn't know who he was, but they didn't care who he was either. That was the problem. They hauled him into the Jefferson County Police Department, where the station smelled like mold and stale coffee, and the air conditioning buzzed like it was running on borrowed time. They didn't book him immediately. They didn't ask questions. They just put him in holding. No phone call, no supervisor, no paperwork until the morning, when he asked for the arresting officer's badge number. The response was a smirk and a condescending. "Don't worry. You'll have time to ask all the questions you want in court." They thought it was over. They thought they'd won. They had no idea they'd just arrested a federal compliance officer assigned to investigate them. Elias sat in that cell for 8 hours. Not pacing, not ranting, just still, listening, recording in his mind everything they said. Every joke, every dismissal. He didn't need to announce who he was. He needed to see who they were when they thought no one would hold them accountable. By morning, a thin file had been started with his name. The charge obstruction. That's all they could muster. They didn't know that by writing that word down. They'd just opened the floodgates. The very next day, Elias submitted an initial internal report to his DOJ supervisor, flagging the stop as unlawful, the force as excessive, and the body cam status as high-risk manipulation. He didn't mention the badge yet. He didn't need to. He wanted to see how far they'd let it go, how deeply they'd bury it. 2 hours later, he received confirmation from DOJ Data Services the body cam assigned to Officer Phelps had experienced 5 separate malfunctions in the last 10 months, all during stops involving minority drivers. Not one during routine traffic enforcement of white motorists. That night, Elias sat at a cheap motel on the edge of town, laptop open, audio files uploading into encrypted folders. The recorder still rested on the nightstand. He hadn't even touched it since pressing that button. He stared at it for a long moment, not in anger, not even in disappointment, but in the kind of silence that comes before a storm. He picked up his badge, slipped it back into his coat, and prepared to walk into court the next morning, knowing the system wouldn't expect what was coming because it never expected someone like him to have both the badge and the burden of doing what no one else had done. Tell the truth, out loud, with evidence and no apologies. As the courtroom slowly came back to life, still reeling from the revelation of Elias Monroe's true identity. The badge on the bench wasn't the only thing changing the room. The oxygen in the air had shifted. You could feel it in the judge's stiff shoulders, in the officer's darting eyes, in the silent murmurs rising like steam from the gallery. But Elias didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Because what mattered now wasn't just who he was. It was what he had. He stepped forward again, calm as ever, and placed a small manila folder next to his badge on the judge's bench. The folder was thin, but its weight hit harder than any accusation. "This isn't about one traffic stop," he said, voice steady, projecting just enough to fill the room without raising an octave. "It's about a pattern." The judge's hands twitched slightly as he opened the folder. Inside were 5 names, 5 dates, 5 complaints filed within the last 18 months, all involving officers from the Jefferson County Police Department. Each report was almost identical in structure, as if copied from the same template driver was non-compliant. Subject became verbally aggressive, use of force deemed necessary. But what tied them together wasn't just the language. It was the void, the absence of truth. Because in all 5 reports, the body camera footage had either gone missing, malfunctioned, or was never activated to begin with. Elias turned slightly, addressing both the bench and the back of the courtroom where the 2 arresting officers sat like statues. "I've reviewed over 200 body cam files in the last year. When you've done this work as long as I have, you begin to notice the things that aren't there. The silences, the blind spots, the erasures." He let that sink in. "In this department alone," Elias continued, "there are 12 recorded instances of equipment failure tied directly to traffic stops involving minority drivers. Yet, not a single failure occurred during routine stops of white motorists. Not one." Gasps stirred from the second row. One woman covered her mouth. Another clutched her purse a little tighter. The prosecutor fumbled with his papers again, as if trying to find a defense that didn't exist. He opened his mouth but said nothing. What could he say? That it was coincidence? That all the devices just happened to break the same way? During the same kinds of stops, Elias pressed on. "One of the names in that file is Jordan Leeds. 22 years old, pulled over less than 3 blocks from his house. No ticket, no arrest. But his complaint mentioned being slammed against his own car after asking for the officer's name. The report filed against him claimed verbal aggression. The body cam was inoperative that night. Another file, Maria Delano, single mother. Pulled over for a taillight she'd replaced the week before. Claimed the officer searched her trunk without consent. Filed a complaint. The response, no further action required. No footage ever reviewed. No follow-up. And another, James Pollard, Vietnam veteran, 63. Walked with a cane. Stopped on foot for suspicious behavior. Said he was pushed against a fence. Officer claimed the subject was uncooperative. Body cam battery failure. The pattern wasn't just disturbing. It was damning. Judge Claiborne's fingers fidgeted on the bench. He looked like a man drowning in paper that suddenly meant something. Realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the courtroom he ruled wasn't built on justice, it was built on routine. Rubber-stamped dismissals, quiet deferrals, insufficient evidence. words meant to smooth over the rough edges of truth. Elias took a breath, not out of fatigue, but out of control, like he was measuring the weight of what he said next. I submitted my full preliminary report to the DOJ Southeast Regional Office this morning, he said. It includes the audio from my own stop, copies of these complaints, and internal tech logs from the department's own systems showing repeated manual deletion of footage logs within 24 hours of complaint submissions. He paused. And the digital trace points back to 2 specific login credentials used multiple times to bypass review protocols. One of those credentials, he glanced toward the back of the room, belongs to Officer Ryan Phelps, the same officer who arrested me. Ryan Phelps didn't move, but his face told the story anyway. Jaw clenched, lips pale, eyes refusing to meet anyone else's. A man in the 3rd row muttered, "Jesus." The truth wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. It had already entered the room. It was sitting in a folder, in a recording device, in the cracks of every report that had been stamped, resolved without ever being questioned. This is what impunity looks like, Elias said. A paper trail of red flags that no one ever reads. Lives disrupted. Dignity stripped. And no accountability because the system was trained to protect itself. Not the people it's supposed to serve. The judge shifted again. "Mr. Monroe." But Elias raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to destroy your courtroom. Your honor. I'm here to remind it what it was built for. No theatrics. No threats. Just truth." And suddenly, the bench that had once stood above him now felt smaller, not because Elias had grown taller, but because the courtroom had been forced to shrink down to the level of its own ignored reality. He turned back toward the 2 officers. "If this badge," he said, tapping the one still resting on the edge of the bench, "is the only reason I get heard, then what happens to the people who don't have one? What happens to the ones who walked into this courtroom before me, told their story, and were told it wasn't enough?" This time, no one had an answer. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the officers, because there was no answer that could unwrite what had been allowed to fester. In the silence that followed, the courtroom didn't just pause. It shifted. It turned, ever so slightly, from a place of assumption into one of awareness. And that was only the beginning. Because patterns don't disappear on their own. They're erased deliberately. Or worse, they're ignored. But now they were on record. Now they were visible. Now they had a name: systemic misconduct, and a voice that refused to let it vanish again. By the time Judge Claiborne adjourned court that morning, the courtroom still hung in stunned silence, like the walls themselves were trying to understand what had just happened. Elias Monroe didn't wait for applause. He simply gathered his badge, his folder, and his calm, and walked out of courtroom 2B with the same quiet purpose he had walked in with. But the silence he left behind, that silence became a seismic pulse, rippling outward, reaching the ears of people who had once believed they were insulated, protected by routine, by habit, by unchecked power. One of those people was Sheriff Benton Lyle, the long-standing head of the Millstone Police Department. He was in his office at 9:12 a.m., sipping from his chipped "World's Oakiest Boss" mug and flipping through paperwork when the call came through. It was a secure line from Atlanta, DOJ Regional Liaison. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, and cold. "Sheriff Lyle," the woman said, I'm calling to inform you that your department is now under active federal audit. This morning, one of our compliance officers appeared in court and confirmed irregular stop patterns and potential tampering of evidence. Wait, what? Benton sat up straighter. Who Elias Monroe? The name hit like a truck. Lyle felt the blood drain from his face. Are you saying he was the one arrested? Yes, sir, by your officer, Ryan Phelps. The arrest has triggered a full departmental review, effective immediately. The line went dead before he could ask another question. But honestly, he didn't need more, because Benton Lyle already knew what this meant. And worse, he knew there was a chance it wasn't a mistake. Downstairs, in the records room that smelled like old toner and stress, Maya Hill, who had been quietly serving as a clerk for more than 10 years, noticed the change before anyone else did. It started with a whisper from the front desk, a rumor about court being flipped upside down by a guy with a federal badge. Then came the sudden flurry of access requests. Maya had seen this pattern before, not in the headlines, in the logs, requests for deletion, timestamp edits, sudden reclassification of reports. She had flagged it once, almost 2 years ago. After a batch of body cam files disappeared under the label incomplete data migration. When she brought it up, she was told it was a tech glitch, standard maintenance. She believed them then. Now, she wasn't so sure. At 10:04 a.m., Maya pulled up the digital access logs for the department's internal case management system. She filtered by officer ID, narrowed it down to the last 48 hours, and hit search. And there it was, Officer Ryan Phelps, logged in 3 separate times since Elias Monroe had been placed in holding. Once at 12:17 a.m., a full hour after the arrest report had been filed. Once again at 6:49 a.m., just before shift change. And the third time, 8:21 a.m., 20 minutes before the court hearing. Each time. He accessed the file tagged Briggsy. That was how the system had filed Elias Monroe under the alias Elias Briggs. Based on the arrest paperwork, each time. He updated metadata, each time. He removed one line, pending review of audio and video evidence. That line gone, deleted manually. Maya's hands hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't a whistleblower. She was just someone who noticed things because she was paid to. But this wasn't a clerical correction. This was a cover-up. And suddenly, the dozens of quiet inconsistencies she'd buried deep in the corners of her memory started rising. A name here, a timestamp there. Reports filed without citations. Complaints closed without interviews. The word non-compliant stamped like a rubber seal over stories that had once come in shaking, crying, or silently burning. By 10:45 a.m., she printed the access logs. By 11:00 a.m., she walked them into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Lyle was sitting behind his desk, still pale, still shaken. A copy of Elias Monroe's DOJ audit notice open in front of him. He looked up as Maya entered, his expression like a man watching a building slowly collapse around him. "You need to see this," she said. She placed the pages on his desk. Lyle scanned them, line by line, time by time. When he reached the third access from Phelps, his hands clenched the paper. He tried to erase it. Maya said softly, "He didn't know you can't delete internal metadata from the audit logs. Only I can." Lyle didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You know," he finally said, "when I started here 24 years ago, I thought if I just kept my head down, kept things smooth, I could avoid becoming one of those stories, the kind that ends up on the front page. He looked at her. I think we're about to be that story. Maya didn't disagree. Because down the hall, Officer Ryan Phelps had just returned from court. His face was pale. His mouth was tight. He walked through the bullpen like a man trying not to be seen, despite the fact that every set of eyes followed him. No one said anything. Not yet. But they all knew. And by noon, word had spread like gasoline catching flame. Elias Monroe wasn't just a name. He was the match. By early afternoon, officers began checking their own files, cross-referencing old cases, wondering which ones might come back. Some found themselves whispering in corners, trying to remember what they'd said on body cam. Others just watched the doors, waiting for the feds to walk in. And that's when it truly began, the quiet collapse of a department that had spent years looking the other way. Because silence doesn't last forever. Not when someone like Elias is listening. Not when someone like Maya is watching. And not when the whole system is finally being asked a question it can't answer. What have you been hiding? It started with a badge on a bench. But by Thursday afternoon, it was the air inside the Millstone Police Department that began to crack. The sound wasn't loud. It was the kind of fracture that happens quietly beneath the surface, behind closed doors, inside long-held routines. The kind of fracture that doesn't announce itself with explosions, but with silence, with stares, with the faint sound of trust being peeled away. Officer Ryan Phelps was the first domino. At exactly 2:47 p.m., after a terse phone call from the DOJ's Southeastern office and a 5-minute internal meeting with Sheriff Benton Lyle, he was suspended effective immediately. The words sounded clinical, procedural, but the tension in the room, that was personal. Lyle didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply handed Phelps a typed notice and said, "Turn in your badge. Leave your service weapon on the desk." Phelps didn't protest. He didn't argue. But his face twisted not with guilt, but with disbelief. Disbelief that his badge wouldn't protect him. That the blue wall he thought would always hold had started crumbling. He walked out the front doors at 3:03 p.m., past officers who no longer made eye contact, past Maya Hill, who watched from the records room doorway with the folder still in her hand. The dominoes didn't stop with Phelps. That same afternoon, Maya met with the federal team already descending upon the department. One of them was Noah Chu, a quiet, unassuming digital forensics analyst from the DOJ's Internal Compliance Division. Noah didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His laptop, sleek and matte black, did most of the talking. They sat in a small, windowless room down the hall from dispatch. The room had once been used for training videos. Now it was a war room. Maya slid the folder across the table. Access logs, login timestamps, metadata comparisons. Noah glanced through the contents, then plugged in an external drive and got to work. Lines of code scrolled across his screen. "You're organized," he said quietly, tapping keys. "This helps." Within 30 minutes, Noah had reconstructed 2 deleted entries from the digital archives. They weren't full videos, those were long gone, likely scrubbed beyond recovery, but what remained told a damning story. Both deletions were performed manually, Noah said, adjusting his glasses, and both used override commands. Maya frowned. "So, not just someone failing to upload?" He shook his head. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional data destruction. That phrase, those 3 words, slid like a knife across the room. Intentional. Data. Destruction. It was no longer a question of what happened. It was now a question of who made it happen, and why the people in charge didn't stop it. Later that evening, Sheriff Benton Lyle sat alone in his office, staring at the notice of suspension for Phelps. He held a pen in one hand but hadn't signed it yet. Not because he was hesitating, but because he was remembering. He remembered the first complaint. A 17-year-old boy, pulled over for having tinted windows too dark. The boy claimed the officer raised his voice, slammed his hands on the hood. The report came to Lyle's desk with a one-line recommendation: insufficient grounds for investigation. Lyle didn't look deeper. He signed it. That was 7 years ago. There had been others. Whispers. Hints. Body cam uploads delayed. Officers mumbling about tech issues. And always. The same result: no follow-up. No escalation. Now it wasn't just neglect. It was evidence. And it had Lyle cornered not by someone else's accusations, but by his own inattention. The slow decay of oversight. The comfortable belief that as long as the town stayed quiet, everything was fine. But things weren't fine. And Elias Monroe had just made sure the world knew it. At 7:06 p.m., Lyle made a decision he should have made years ago. He stood up, walked to the locker behind his desk, and retrieved the internal oversight ledger, a thick binder that hadn't been opened in 2 years. Dust coated the top. He flipped to the most recent tab and started reading. Names, dates, cases, and then, in red ink on a post-it stuck to a page, dated March 12th, a note scribbled by a junior officer. Footage missing. Need admin override. He had initialed it. He had forgotten. By 8:30 p.m., the DOJ audit team had set up in 3 different rooms, one for records, one for server access, one for personnel files. Maya handed over a second batch of logs. Noah was reconstructing a third deleted access attempt. And Lyle. He walked into the operations wing and addressed the staff himself. No memo, no pre-written statement. Just a man standing in the wreckage of his own leadership. We failed, he said plainly, not just in a mistake, in culture, in oversight, in how we protected silence more than people. No one clapped, but no one looked away either, because the fracture was no longer under the surface. It was visible now. It was real, and it was widening. It started like any other community meeting: folding chairs, lukewarm coffee in foam cups, and a podium that squeaked when the mayor leaned on it. But by the time the clock hit 6:32 p.m., that town hall was no longer a quiet civic formality. It had become something entirely different. Alive. Electric. Unstoppable. The kind of room that hums when silence finally breaks after years of being swallowed. Word had spread fast. Not just about the arrest of a DOJ auditor. Not just about the missing body cam footage or Officer Ryan Phelps's suspension. But about the bigger truth. Millstone had been seen, and someone, Elias Monroe, had forced the mirror to turn. By sunset, over 100 people had packed into the municipal center's assembly hall. Some stood near the walls. Others overflowed into the lobby, craning necks to hear. The mayor, a cautious man named Arthur Brimley, had called the meeting hoping to get ahead of the headlines. He didn't realize the people were the headline now, at the front. Elias stood near the back wall, arms crossed, eyes steady. He wasn't there to speak. He was there to listen. He always did his best work in the quiet. The first to step forward was a young man named Terrence Monroe, no relation, dressed in a mechanic's shirt, grease still on his fingers. He spoke softly into the mic. "Last October," he said. "I got pulled over for a broken plate light. Officer said I looked nervous, told me to get out the car. I did. He searched everything, glove box, trunk, under my seat. Found nothing. Let me go. No apology. No body cam footage when I tried to file a complaint. Said the system was down." He looked up. "Now I know why." The room murmured. Heads nodded. Then came Aisha Green, a grandmother who walked with a cane but stood with steel in her spine. "In 2018, she said, my grandson was 17, just got his license, drove to the gas station. Officer pulled him out of the car, cuffed him on the ground, said he fit a description. I asked for the footage. They said the camera malfunctioned. I've been carrying that pain for 5 years, and they told me it was just how things worked." A hush fell. Elias blinked slowly. His jaw set, not in anger, but in grim recognition. He'd heard this story before, just with different names, different years, different lies. Then the microphone passed to Janelle Ward. She stepped forward in a deep blue head wrap and a simple black blouse. Her voice trembled at first, but only for a moment. "My son Andre," she said, "is 16. He plays trombone in the high school marching band. Last month, he was walking home from practice in uniform, still carrying the case. 2 officers stopped him, told him to open it. He said it was just his instrument. They told him to shut up and put his hands on the wall. A murmur of anger rose from the crowd. They searched his bag, made him miss his bus." She continued. "He cried when he got home, not because he was scared, because he thought he did something wrong. He asked me if he looked like a criminal." Her voice cracked. "He's 16. And just like that." The room changed. The quiet wasn't silence anymore. It was fuel. Someone from the back shouted, "How many more stories like this?" Another voice. "Why didn't we speak sooner than a third?" "Because nobody was listening." But now they were. Mayor Brimley stepped back up, face pale, lips pursed. We are cooperating fully with the federal review," he stammered, "and we're working with Sheriff Lyle to restore trust." "Trust was never there," someone interrupted. The room erupted, not in violence, not in chaos, but in truth. Story after story. Parents, teachers, a delivery driver, a retired veteran. They spoke of being followed home, pulled over without cause, called names, told they were lucky to walk away. Each story was another brick pulled from the foundation of a system built on silence. At one point, Elias shifted slightly in the back, not to speak, but to observe. He was watching the most important thing unfold, not a raid, not a ruling, but something more powerful, belief. Because, for the first time, the people in that room believed that maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't a myth, that accountability wasn't reserved for headlines and courtrooms in bigger cities, that it could happen here. And the moment they believed, that everything changed. When Sheriff Lyle finally walked into the hall, having just come from reviewing internal logs and realizing just how deep the rot ran, he didn't try to speak right away. He looked at the crowd, the mothers, the fathers, the kids who grew up thinking police were just a part of the background noise of fear. He raised the mic with tired hands. "I don't have a speech," he said, "but I have ears, and I'm going to use them." He turned to face Janelle. "Your son should have never been treated that way. I'm sorry." Janelle stared at him. She didn't nod. She didn't clap. But she didn't walk away either. And in that pause, that silence, something else shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't approval, it was possibility. And that was all Elias Monroe needed. He turned to go, slipping out a side door, coat over one arm. He didn't need the spotlight. His job was never to be the story. It was to spark the ones that mattered. Behind him. The town hall was still buzzing. People who had never spoken now exchanged numbers. Elders patted teenagers on the back. Eyes that once looked away now held contact a little longer, because the community had found its voice. And now that it had, it wouldn't let go again. By the following Monday morning, the mood in Millstone had shifted from rumbling unrest to something sharper, inevitable transformation. The town wasn't just awake now, it was wide-eyed, teeth clenched, and standing at the edge of a reckoning it could no longer postpone. The community had spoken, loudly, clearly, and the silence that had once protected the system. It had been shattered by stories, by grief, by names that refused to stay buried. And now, Elias Monroe was ready to hand over the truth. He arrived at City Hall at 8:30 a.m. sharp, wearing the same quiet suit, the same calm presence, the same expression that said, "I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to hold up a mirror." He carried a single file folder, but the weight of it was heavier than any courtroom testimony. Inside were the formal Department of Justice findings painstakingly compiled over the past 10 days by Elias and his audit team. Everything had been double verified. Every timestamp, every metadata trace, every complaint, every file access log, nothing speculative, nothing emotional, just evidence. He was escorted to the conference room by the mayor's assistant. Seated inside were Mayor Arthur Brimley, former Sheriff Benton Lyle, DOJ compliance lead Grace Mendoza, and 2 council members from the Oversight Subcommittee. Elias took his seat and opened the folder without ceremony. "These," he said quietly, "are the final findings of the preliminary audit into the Millstone Police Department." He passed the copies around the table. 7 confirmed instances of officer misconduct. He continued, 4 violations of DOJ procedural standards, including failure to log use of force incidents and improper detainment of minors. He paused. 2 confirmed cases of intentional evidence tampering, one of which involved my own arrest. The room stilled. Even Lyle, who had aged a decade in the past week, lowered his head not in surprise, but in shame. Elias didn't soften the delivery. Our team also reviewed complaint resolution practices dating back 5 years. We found systemic inconsistencies in how complaints were classified and followed up. Of the 22 filed, 16 were dismissed without proper interview or evidence review. 11 of those involved the same 3 officers. He didn't name them. Not yet. The silence was thick. Grace Mendoza broke it with a clipped sentence. "We're recommending federal oversight, beginning immediately. All patrol operations will be subject to audit until the new accountability framework is fully implemented." Mayor Brimley leaned back, visibly shaken. "What does that mean for us?" "Practically," Elias answered without pause, "it means the town rebuilds, with transparency, with supervision, and without denial." That's when Sheriff Lyle, still technically holding his title, spoke up. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "I don't want to be the face of a department that's become the problem," he said. "I won't argue your findings. I failed. I let things slide because it was easier than digging. And that makes me complicit." Then he pulled a folded paper from his jacket and slid it forward. "My resignation, effective immediately." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mayor Brimley nodded, accepted. Lyle stood, nodded once at Elias, something between gratitude and apology, and walked out of the room, leaving behind a department and a legacy forever altered. The rest of the meeting wasn't filled with drama. It was filled with details, action items, deadlines, names, structures. Grace outlined the framework for a civilian oversight board made up of elected community members with the power to review complaints and access departmental footage. Elias presented the draft for revised use of force protocols, stricter body cam activation policies, and a zero-tolerance clause for any future tampering. Mayor Brimley, still trying to steady himself, asked the question many officials fear most. What happens if we don't follow through? Elias looked at him, calm and clear. Then Millstone becomes a federal case file. No one questioned him again. By 10:35 a.m., the meeting adjourned. By 11:00 a.m., the mayor held a press conference outside City Hall. No podium, no teleprompter, just honesty. He confirmed the findings, acknowledged the resignations, announced the immediate drafting of new departmental policies, and most importantly, he stated on record that the Civilian Oversight Board would be formed within 30 days, with town-wide applications opening that afternoon. News spread fast. Faster this time. Not as a scandal, but as a shift. People who had once whispered in fear now spoke with purpose. Those who had doubted the system could ever change now began to believe cautiously, but truthfully. At the high school, a civics teacher played the press conference over the intercom. At the community center, Janelle Ward smiled quietly as she filled out an application for the new oversight board. And at the police department, the atmosphere was quiet, sober. Not from fear, but from the realization that the rules had changed. Officers logged their reports more carefully. Body cams were double-checked. The new interim chief, a woman named Vanessa Kim, appointed that morning, walked the halls with a clipboard. Not to scold, but to make clear, we're not hiding anymore. We're rebuilding. If you can't handle that turn in your badge. No one did. Not that day. As for Elias, he didn't stick around for applause. He never did. He spent the rest of the day reviewing follow-ups with Grace, coordinating next steps with the DOJ's Transparency Office, and preparing to return to Atlanta. There were more towns, more systems, more silence waiting to be broken. But before he left, he stopped by the edge of Millstone Square. A small crowd had gathered, nothing formal. Just folks talking, sharing, smiling, even. Janelle saw him from across the street and gave him a quiet nod. It wasn't gratitude. It was respect. He returned it. Then he walked away, because the badge had done its part. But the people, they were doing the rest. Elias Monroe didn't wait for sunrise. At 5:42 a.m., he quietly slid his motel key into the drop box outside the front office, adjusted the strap on his leather shoulder bag, and stepped into the soft, gray light of early morning in Millstone, Georgia. No cameras followed. No reporters stood at the curb. There were no headlines waiting for him this time, and that was exactly how he wanted it. His work here was done. The federal oversight was in motion. The new Civilian Review Board was forming. Policy drafts were circulating. And the name Millstone no longer sat in the dark corners of closed case files. It was out in the open, standing like a scar that had been stitched up, not hidden. The reckoning had happened, and now the healing could begin. Not fast, not painlessly, but for the first time in decades, truth had the room to breathe. Elias didn't head straight for the highway. Instead, He took a quiet detour down Monroe Avenue, a street he hadn't walked since the day of the town hall. He kept his coat buttoned, his pace easy, his presence unremarkable. No one bothered him. Most folks were still asleep, or just beginning to stir teachers packing lunchboxes, shopkeepers unlocking their doors. A city waking up to a new kind of accountability. At the corner of Jefferson and 5th, Elias stopped. There, painted on the outer brick wall of the courthouse, was something he hadn't expected: a mural. It hadn't been there 2 days ago. Now it stretched across the side of the building in vivid strokes of cobalt blue, sienna, and soft amber. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't polished. But it was true. A row of faces looked out from the brick. Not famous faces, not politicians or police, just people. A woman with deep smile lines and a folded apron. A teenage boy in a marching band uniform, holding a trombone case. A tired man with salt and pepper hair, arms crossed. A little girl clutching a teddy bear. None of them had names written under their portraits, but Elias recognized them. Janelle Ward's son, Terrence from the mechanic's shop. The elderly vet who'd spoken about 1989. These weren't martyrs or monuments. They were reminders etched in paint and pigment that power doesn't come from a podium or a badge. It comes from presence, from memory, from the refusal to forget what happened and to demand more moving forward. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, the wind tugging gently at the hem of his coat. Across the street, a middle schooler in a gray hoodie walked past on the way to the bus stop. He paused when he saw Elias. For a second. The kid just stared like he was trying to decide if this quiet man with the lined face and worn shoes was really the guy from the video clip his cousin had shown him. Then, without a word, the boy gave him a nod. Simple, honest, full of weight. And Elias returned it. That was the kind of respect that mattered, not fear-based compliance, not forced authority, but a shared acknowledgement. I see you. You matter. We both remember. He didn't linger. He never did. By 6:15 a.m., he was back in his rental, pulling onto the bypass that looped around the heart of Millstone. The courthouse and the mural disappeared in the rear view, but not from his mind. Nothing about this place would vanish easily. And it shouldn't. The voices he'd helped amplify didn't need him anymore. They had found strength in each other. That was the point. Elias didn't travel from town to town for glory. He wasn't chasing revenge or validation. He was protecting the space after the silence. Because in every town like Millstone, silence is never just the absence of sound. It's a tool, a shield, a weapon used by systems that thrive in the shadows. Silence hides misconduct. It muffles outrage. It whispers, just let it go. But when one person dares to shatter that silence with evidence, with truth, with quiet conviction, it doesn't go back together again. That's what real power looks like. Not control, not domination, not loudness. It's what happens after the silence breaks. It's what Janelle's voice did in that town hall. It's what Maya did when she slid those access logs across the table. It's what the boy in the hoodie understood in a glance. It's staying present when the cameras leave. As the miles rolled past and the sun crept higher behind him, Elias reached for the burner phone sitting on the passenger seat. One missed call. No voicemail. He dialed the number he knew by heart. The line clicked. A woman's voice answered on the first ring. "This is Mendoza." Elias spoke softly. "I'm done here." A pause. "You ready for the next one?" He looked out the window. The landscape was changing farmland turning to pine groves, city skyline fading in the distance. "Yeah," he said. "Send it." She didn't ask if he was tired. Didn't offer praise. She knew better. He wasn't in it for either. He ended the call and drove on. Another town. Another crack in another wall. But behind him, in Millstone, something had shifted permanently. A department had been broken open. A sheriff had stepped down. New policies had been born in the ashes of old excuses. And on the courthouse wall, faces once lost in silence now watched over a town determined never to go quiet again. In every corner of America, there's a millstone waiting to be seen. A quiet town. A forgotten report. A camera that doesn't click on. What Elias Monroe exposed wasn't just one department's failure. It was a mirror held up to a nation that too often looks away. This story reminds us that silence is never neutral. It protects power. It shelters misconduct. And unless someone stands up, it stays unbroken. But the moment one voice rises, like Elias, like Janelle Ward, like Maya Hill, change begins. That's the lesson here. Not that justice is instant, but that it's possible. Not that systems collapse overnight, but that truth makes the first crack. Every American citizen should understand this. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Whether you're walking home from practice, working a late shift, or just driving through a town, your dignity is not up for debate. And when someone abuses that, when power is used to intimidate rather than protect, accountability must follow. This isn't about left or right. It's about right and wrong. About respect that's earned, not demanded. About justice that reaches every zip code, not just the ones with influence. Elias didn't ask for applause. He didn't seek headlines. He just did the job one quiet day at a time. But his actions lit a fuse. And now, it's our turn. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Ask questions at your local town hall. Support oversight. Push for transparency. Hold your leaders accountable. Because change doesn't live in hashtags, it lives in action. If even one more voice rises because of this, then it mattered. So, do your part. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with friends, neighbors, family, anyone who still believes that truth, even whispered, is more powerful than lies shouted from podiums. Let's build a country where silence no longer wins. Let's break it together. And remember, the badge doesn't make the person. The action does. You don't need a title to make a difference. You just need the courage to speak. And if you're already doing that, we see you. Keep going. We're with you every step of the way.